All right, welcome everybody to this month's Investing in Identity Forum. I'm your host and moderator for today, Travis Jarae, and the founder CEO of One World Identity. If you aren't familiar with us, we're a research and advisory firm focused squarely on the identity, trust, and data economy. And we do a few things here. We do growth strategy, transaction services, and product innovation and design for a handful of companies across all industries. Anybody that really views identity as a critical component to whatever they're trying to build or deploy. And just over the past couple of years here, we've deployed about 35 different growth strategies, supported over $4.5 billion in M&A since 2019, and launched about 25 new products into about 150 different countries. So quite a bit of work there. And with that, just want to welcome you all again to the Investing in Identity Forum. This will be the last month it's going to look like this. So I'm just kind of giving you a little bit of a teaser for some exciting news that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. So keep your eyes peeled on this. But really excited to have your typical cast and crew with me. Cameron, one of our managing directors here at OWI, and Dave Fields, partner at PTB Ventures. Thanks, guys.
Good to be here.
Good to be back.
As always. All right. Well, you know, we typically look at August as a month of sitting somewhere on a beach, vacationing, not a lot happening. But this August, obviously a bit different. There's still a lot of activity happening in the market. And we wanted to call out these 4 deals, these 4 fundraisers as kind of some of those larger ones. I think those more important ones that we saw. First, of course, coming from Rapid, raising about $300 million on a $8.75 billion valuation. Rapid, obviously, one of those massive growth stories. I love the valuation on this. They were raising about $2 billion earlier this year. They saw 3x growth, and they said that's going to be the new number if you want to fundraise. And so they were able to take in an extra $300 million with no questions asked. We'll come back to what that money is going to be used for here in a minute. Centilink, also another really cool company coming out of the Bay Area. These guys are former Affirm employees taking in $70 million to grow this company. I believe they started in 2017, mid 2017, to kind of grow that quickly and see the success they have. These are guys that have a very good brand reputation in the space, seeing that early adoption from a number of financial services providers and starting to build a very solid reputation that's definitely worth keeping your eyes on. Finite State, another company that's really, really cool, very interesting as the identity of things becomes probably something we're going to be talking about a lot more in the coming months and years, as identity has started to move not just around people and entities, but also including things. So we're starting to keep our eyes peeled for a lot more of those companies, seeing investment coming in from a network security or endpoint security perspective. Finite State being one of those companies taking in $30 million to help support that. And then lastly, a company that we actually weren't super familiar with here at OWI is Unico. It's a Brazilian startup. They're actually worth over $1 billion now. So this is a unicorn, maybe why they just recently changed their brand name to this. Taking another $120 million into the space. And they actually have a pretty significant stack of services that, again, we'll cover here in a few minutes when we take it to the landscape. We also saw some notable acquisitions and mergers starting to happen this past month. Equifax with Appriss Insights coming in to acquire. I think this is going to be a really interesting deal, and we're going to break this down into some bigger detail on the next slide. But what is really kind of caught our eyes is Avast and NortonLifeLock. This is the 3rd largest cybersecurity deal of all time. I think this is a fantastic opportunity for both companies to create something really, truly unique. Those will put them at about 500 million consumers, cybersecurity consumer users. So I think this is actually a really, really interesting deal. I think there's large implications for our entire industry. As you guys have all, if this is your first time joining this Investing in Identity Forum, or maybe it's your second time, 3rd time, 4th time, 100th time, whatever it is, you probably have already started to hear us talk about consumers and consumer digital identity. This merger will really shake up what consumer digital identity is going to become in the near future. So with that, we're going to go ahead and take it to the landscape. And again, if this is your first time joining in Investing in Identity Forum, this is our digital identity landscape. You can actually get more information on this particular landscape on our website, oneworldidentity.com. But for those of you that are used to kind of seeing this. There will be some changes coming up shortly. So, you guys will probably get something in your mailbox probably over the next 4 or 5 weeks. Keep your eyes peeled with. But for now, we're going to still be using this landscape to kind of guide us for how this activity is shaking up the market. So the first one is Rapid. So real quick, the red circles, the circles are first and foremost on the top side of the solution segment. The reds are the current position, and the blue are where these companies have a real opportunity to move into. So this is kind of where we're kind of guessing, if you will. We're making some educated guesses on where these companies are moving into. So Rapid, I'll turn it over to you, Cameron. Tell us about Rapid. Why does this deal, why does this fundraising kind of make sense? How is this kind of shaking things up? And then Dave, of course, want to toss it to you on the same question.
Yeah. So, I think we had some of this conversation in our, pre-chat, which is normally, a payments network player like Rapid might not qualify for making the landscape in this discussion, which is really focused around digital identity. But why this has popped for us is specifically that Rapid has called out that they're looking to expand into this regulatory compliance transaction monitoring side of their business. Obviously, digital identity playing a huge part of these platforms, understanding, how their customers are behaving, applying risk profiles, and meeting regulatory and compliance mandates. And they have fairly openly signaled that that is what this fundraise is for, is moving into that space. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think you have already seen Stripe, for example, making a similar push into the identity verification market. And I think as you continue seeing these platforms continue to grow and these valuations continue to rise, they're going to need to look to adjacencies to this payment space to continue justifying these valuations. And I think this risk and compliance, transaction monitoring piece is a natural fit, given they're already sitting on all this transaction data, and leveraging this more directly for the compliance piece makes a lot of sense from a vertical integration efficiency perspective.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well said. I don't want to jump too much on kind of what a topic is that we have coming up a little later, but one way to think of Rapid is an orchestration layer for payments. They combine a number of different capabilities to make it very easy for their customers or the businesses they serve to then accept payments from consumers. And in so doing, by building this capability that's generalizable across a range of different segments and markets, they're now privy to a lot of data that they can use to build other services and products. And so, very interesting company. It'll be interesting to see how they grow and develop, and certainly hits on a lot of topics and themes that we've emphasized on the webinar previous months.
Yeah, and I think with that, when I think about Rapid, we hear this a lot. There's a lot of questions, a lot of new investors kind of coming into the space. And you might be one listening to this right now, and maybe you're evaluating the market as a whole, or kind of looking at maybe doing some preliminary due diligence or early due diligence on one of these orchestration players, as most of them are out in market in some form or fashion doing some fundraising. There is a lot of connection points between kind of core banking or fintech as a service and orchestration providers. And I think trying to evaluate those similarities and differences is very critical, and something that's it is a bit of a splitting hairs type of exercise at times. But I think Rapid here is a really good example of a company kind of doing it all, which kind of takes us into a company that's really focused on the identity piece here. Centilink, out of all these companies on the list here, Centilink is one that's really hyper focused on the identity verification space. We're seeing, again, they're kind of mentioned this before, they're seeing a lot of early adoption from the financial services players. Raising $70 million is no small feat. So obviously, they're probably doing quite well. We'll expect to see them moving into the fraud prevention and risk management space. So what we mean by that is bringing on capabilities that will support more actions, either pre-onboarding or immediately post-onboarding. We'll cover this a little bit here when we break down the integrated identity platform approach, but we think Centilink's one of those companies that really has a strong position to to make something happen with regards to expanding into that fraud prevention and risk management side. And for identity proofing, this could be as simple for them as to add in that biometrics capabilities through partnership. Something that used to be a major blocker to breaking into an identity proofing stack is now kind of table stakes. So we're going to probably expect to see them, and perhaps they already have it on their product roadmap or inside their product today. And then I want to move over to Finite State. Cameron, I'm going to kick it back over to you again to talk about these guys. Obviously, we don't really usually have people in the top right part of our map here. So it's great to kind of see us starting to color that in. Give us a little bit about Finite State and why we're talking about it.
Yeah, a really cool platform. So, their core value proposition is really understanding the risk that you face as an organization from, the devices that you're bringing into your network, and not just, the surface level security threats, like what applications are running on top of them, but actually what about the firmware and the kind of components and software pieces at a very root level that make up your network. Obviously, this was something that was in the news a while back with that very contentious Bloomberg article about the purported supply chain hack of Apple. And while the veracity of that story, I think, remains subject to debate, you see it bubbling up every now and again in places like Tech Dirt. The question remains, like, when you are bringing these devices, into your company's network, what do we really know about them? Because, the modern supply chain infrastructure for these technology devices is so deep, and you have many layers of, value add manufacturers buying, subcomponents and bringing them together to make a finished product. Finite State is really all about kind of almost applying an identity layer to these devices. So they kind of go and recreate piece by piece that supply chain, and then apply a risk score to these devices based on what they know about all of the sourcing and origins of each of the subcomponents, whether it's the physical pieces of them as well as the firmware. So in many ways, you can, again, think of this as applying an identity to these components, just like, you as an individual almost have a resume that you are looking to share out, with a digital wallet, like, hey, I, attended this university, this was my GPA, I worked at these places, Deloitte, the New York Stock Exchange. This is almost that concept, but for the device itself, the physical components of an electronic IoT component itself. So really, really interesting to see this concept of identity kind of, again, pushing out towards the edges of this map. And I think this isn't the last that we're going to see from this space as, IoT devices continue to proliferate, and the security threats posed by, firmware vulnerabilities, hardware vulnerabilities continue to have a pretty large impact.
Yeah, and just to kind of drop in on this, I know we only have the identity of things here colored blue, but you can really kind of take another blue dot to certifications, workforce IAM, authentication, and kind of drag that down around the map. We're starting to see companies like Pindrop and others move from the mobile identity side of things up towards this top right with mesh network security, with IoT device security, whether that's inside your car or inside your home. So we'll probably start to see more companies kind of start from the middle and move out. Here's a company moving from the outside in. And moving on to the stranger to us, but clearly not the stranger to many, is Unico. These guys have done a fantastic, they've been around since 2007, obviously going through the rebrand more recently, but kind of raising that valuation up over $1 billion as a Brazilian unicorn is no small feat. Investors like General Atlantic, definitely bolster their reputation in this space. SoftBank. So these guys are the real deal. So definitely worth keeping your eyes peeled for these guys, how they're going to continue building out, if they're going to remain in Latin America, in Brazil, or if we're going to start to see these guys moving into North America and into Europe, like we have seen many Brazilian companies in the near past. Here you have a company that does not have congruency across the landscape. And if you guys are interested in how to break down this landscape and how we evaluate companies based off of their positioning, you can check out our February, I believe it's our February identity, investing in identity forum, where we actually go through the golden cog strategy. So I would definitely say go check that out. But one of those main takeaways in how to value a company's position is to see how well those pieces fit together. Here you actually have a gap between their solution segments. And even on their website, when you kind of dig into who they are and what they're trying to build, they actually break out their products into two completely separate products. I think there's a people and check. So two completely different separate products, even broken down to the content level. And you can kind of see that here when you break down their product features, which we see. They've just raised this money for some acquisitions. They're pretty public about that. We're expecting them to start to merge these two things. So we'll be seeing these guys looking at the mobile identity side, perhaps an identity wallet, as they've been able to proof identities throughout Brazil. Moving into fraud prevention, risk management, obviously a very hot space, can continue to grow. And then SIAM, right? SIAM, fraud prevention, risk management are the two biggest and hottest spaces. We see these guys really well positioned to move into that. This is where their gaps are on their product. Product is today. They just raised this money. So if you're a Brazilian company, if you're working in LATAM and you have these types of services, I would be looking at these guys as a potential partner because obviously they're very clearly well positioned. Dave, you and I did not prepare at all for this one, but I'm going to go to ask you what your thoughts are on these guys now that you see it up on the map here.
Right. So there's actually a couple, from an investor perspective and sort of a VC, on the VC side, it's interesting that two of the biggest deals we've seen in authentication and back-to-back months that we've talked about have been led or co-led by General Atlantic. So General Atlantic is sort of late stage growth and venture. They tend to write, I believe they raise mostly $10 billion funds. They write really, really big checks. They also split the transmit security round with Insight Partners. So we've now seen them team up with other investors to invest in authentication. So what that tells me is that General Atlantic, why would you fund companies that are potentially competitive? They've probably done some sort of market analysis where they feel like there's some verticalization to these authentication solutions. And what I mean by that is that they're somewhat constrained by market or an industry. In this instance, it's probably geography. There's probably something that Unico has done very specific. First for Brazil, it's probably generalizable to South America and LATAM, as we've discussed. Whereas Transmit is much more around orchestrating authentication journeys, letting you use whatever type of authenticator or mechanism, making it easier for sort of, I think it's largely banks and e-commerce, and they're primarily, I believe, in the US and Europe. So you kind of have this bifurcation of growth or emerging markets and developed markets, and we have one investor who's betting on both. So that was the thing that jumped out to me when I saw this headline, is just General Atlantic's involvement. And years past we wouldn't have seen VCs investing in competitive entities. So there's probably some distinction or nuance here that we're not fully picking up on and just looking at the press releases around authentication.
Yeah, I think it's a really good call out. And then that takes us to our M&A activity here. And so, Cameron, I'll leave you this one. Tell us about Equifax. I think this is actually Equifax Workforce Solutions. So I'm sure we'll get an email from the marketing and branding team over there. But in the meantime, tell us about Equifax and Appriss Insights.
Yeah, so I don't think there's anything too new and exciting that I can share with the audience about Equifax. I think they're a fairly known quantity. Appriss Insights, an interesting one. I guess you'd call them in many ways a fraud and risk platform. They have some really interesting fraud products around things like healthcare, for example. They are the ones who kind of pioneered that system of where if you want to buy Sudafed, you have to scan your driver's license. They can monitor who is buying, too many constituent parts for making methamphetamine, for example. They also have a really interesting healthcare platform that connects healthcare professionals and coordinates care solutions and drives advanced analytics there as well. From a market perspective, I think you see here, we expect this to enable Equifax to continue, building out their foothold in the fraud prevention and risk management space with potential additions into electronic medical records, regulatory compliance, transaction monitoring, as well as potentially customer IAM as well. So, Equifax obviously previously acquired Count. I think that was tipping their hand a little bit, that again, this fraud prevention risk management space really of interest to them for the continued growth of their business. And I think Appriss layers in new and interesting capabilities across some different verticals like healthcare to the platform.
Yeah, I think $1.8 billion on top of the 680 earlier this year into the space from those guys, really kind of saying quite a bit, right? I think this is a very interesting kind of position for Equifax, continuing to make acquisitions. This is a company that I think a lot of people a year ago was saying, why isn't Equifax making more deals, especially after Experian and GB kind of, and TransUnion really starting to kind of heat up on the M&A deal flow side. Now, of course, they're coming out making some pretty big bets. So I actually really like this play. I think it's going to be really interesting. I want to keep my eyes peeled for how things start to play out. Appriss obviously split out some of this company, right? So this is not the whole company. This is just a lot of the data analytics components of it. Let's see how that all starts to kind of play out and what that kind of brand marketing changes for Equifax and how you as our audience, if you're a product manager or if you're a CEO and you're looking at this one, let's see what those partnership opportunities are, right? Let's see what can happen here between these organizations and what that can mean for you guys. And let's take it over to Avast and NortonLifeLock. Obviously, as I kind of mentioned, this is the third largest cybersecurity deal of all time. That's right behind Thoma Bravo's $12.3 billion takeover Proofpoint and Broadcom's $10.7 billion acquisition of Symantec. Symantec's enterprise business. So obviously a really, really big deal. Both companies have, Avast and NortonLifeLock have seen growth, not amazing growth, but continue to grow, especially on the consumer cybersecurity side. This merger will have some pretty big implications for the entire consumer digital identity space. We're talking about 500 million users, consumer cybersecurity users coming into one platform. Both NortonLifeLock and Avast have full suites of services between password managers, antivirus, identity theft protection, network information security, etc. They have these things already built in. But what they have also is they have an aging population. Typically, it's a white middle-class family buying this type of service. Typically, your average age of somebody is between 55 and 65 or 70, and they're buying it for their children as well. So we see kind of this interesting gap between somebody that's the age of 22, leaving college in most cases, all the way up to 55. That gap needs to be filled, right? We are looking for services. We're looking for solutions there. I think Avast, NortonLifeLock can come up with some really interesting solutions to kind of fill that age gap, that demographic gap that has been kind of the bane for a lot of consumer cybersecurity adoption in the last decade. I think where they can really move, and I think where we're going to see some interesting stuff here is an identity wallet and self-sovereign identity. Avast recently hired Charlie Walton as the GM for identity. I think that's going to play a pretty big role into any sort of consumer identity related activities. So it should be interesting to see what Charlie and the Avast team are bringing to the table with Vincent and team over at NortonLifeLock. I'll open it up to Dave if you have any other additional thoughts on these guys.
I mean, I think from a market standpoint, you said this is the third largest deal. We're now having sort of large record-breaking deals being announced in sort of like rapid succession. I think the important point is that this is going to normalize activity. Previously corporate boards may have been reluctant, or corporate dev teams, to step up to this sort of $10 billion plus or minus range around cyber activity, and now that's quickly being normalized on both the LBO side or the sponsor side, as well as on the corporate M&A side. So I suspect that by the end of this year, that 3 ranking, this is probably going to get pushed down. There's probably going to be a couple more deals that's going to push this well down in the rankings, and we're now just going to see, this is just going to become a normal thing to see $10 billion deals announced in the cybersecurity market. Probably also reflects just that people are becoming much more comfortable with both the existing market size and growth dynamics. So you have a market that on some level is very big, somewhat mature, but still in its sort of maybe middle stages of growth is probably where I would put it. And so that's what I think these like in the more generalizable, what's the point that we can kind of abstract away from this? That's what I kind of take away.
Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, big shout out and kudos to Vincent and Andre from the Avast and LifeLock team. Very exciting to see what those two teams do together. And that takes us into our main topics this month. We are going to cover two topics. First is the rise of the orchestration vendor. We're going to break down a little bit of kind of the market dynamics to why we're starting to see orchestration vendors really kind of tip the scales in terms of conversation and in terms of value proposition. And then second, we're going to revisit the COVID passport. This is something that we've now had on here as a main topic two times this year. As we've started to learn more, as we've started to see things start to further develop, what that consumer sentiment is, I think we're at a really interesting point in time there that we're going to break down as well. So let's go ahead and jump right into the rise of the orchestration vendor. And so, here, yes, this is actually a slide that's more from our advisory side of the house, a little bit less flashy and exciting, like the no identity stuff. But what we are seeing here in terms of our trends is our notable market activity. These are big numbers. We're starting to see a lot of players in the space. Now, every month we cover some of these deals, not all of them, but we do cover some of these deals. So far this year, we've seen about $37 billion, excuse me, in total market activity. So this is kind of a rapidly growing, big dollars and cents kind of starting to happen. Now, a lot of those large raises are for dry powder. It's for acquisition. So that a lot of the cash is either going to either secondaries, which is buying out some folks, and then a lot of it's going to the balance sheet for the purposes of acquisition. And so this is not super surprising at this point if you're a longtime listener, that this is something that we'll be talking about quite a bit. But we're starting to see these companies start to make their moves. They're starting to buy these companies, and as a result, they're needing to piece together their strategy. And a lot of those strategies really revolve around two main topics. The first is automation, and the second is orchestration. Currently, the automation side is a lot of how do we make things better, faster, more efficient, right? So you're seeing a lot of AI, machine learning companies like Element are really strong at the AI and machine learning components of this. And then you're seeing companies like Alloy being very strong on the orchestration side. And so right now we're really kind of looking at here as these orchestration players kind of being the driver's seat against a lot of these big valued companies that raised money to build out their platform capabilities. So right now, this is kind of, again, think two paths. One is automation, the second being orchestration. In the automation path, we're not going to cover that today, but it's equally as important. Here we're looking really at the orchestration side of things. And right now we do really believe that they're strongly well positioned to capture this onboarding flow where a lot of the conversation is being dominated today. And then that will lead into this broader, more long-term relationship with the customer. And so from today, we're starting to see this many vendors solving just this, this is yesterday. So kind of like last year, 2 years ago, really kind of starting at mid 2015, 2016, many vendors solving one unique challenge. We solve for document scanning. We solve for OCR. We solve for X. Today, now we're starting to see those vendors starting to consolidate. We solve for document scanning, OCR, liveness detection. We solve for behavioral biometrics, analytics, and IDV. We solve for IDV, you get the point, IDV, KYC proofing, right? So now we're starting to see more of those solution segments across our landscape starting to merge together. You're making this quite difficult from an analyst perspective to track these things so quickly, given how these capabilities are merging so quickly. And then tomorrow, we're starting to see these robust platforms. And we really kind of think about these as integrated identity platforms. And this is actually kind of the way that we really view this, right? So this is more of our integrated identity platform capability set, starting at new engagement, going through ongoing engagement. So new engagement, this is your lead generation, your ad targeting, your resolution. Kind of think about your ad tech, your MarTech side of the business, starting to fold into registration. So kind of that registration bucket, account opening down through SIAM, that registration bucket is where we're seeing a bigger focus on orchestration today. This is where we're really seeing some of those platforms, especially the way that we're talking about it, really starting to kind of fold together. Of course, we were just talking about a lot of the login authentication components with General Atlantic being kind of a big investor in that space, but all the way going through this ongoing engagement. And we're seeing this ongoing engagement component a lot with your mobile identity companies or your CPaaS firms. These are companies that have some form of A2P messaging, or they can have some engagement, some ongoing engagement, as the chevron would indicate, some ongoing engagement with those customers to be able to communicate directly with them, so they're kind of involved in this process. So on top of all this whole thing, and by the way, you can have a great business in each and every single one of these. There's no doubt about it. On top of this, we're seeing two major things, not including automation, because again, we're keep that totally separate. One is networks and signal sharing. This has been kind of the holy grail. We've been talking about this a lot. We've seen a lot of consortium plays using this. We haven't really seen a very, very strong contender. Of course, we're starting to see some emerge. But on top of that, it's also this orchestration side, tying things together. This can be in addition to a network, but also separately from that network. And so this is really where we're seeing the big value when we're looking across at how do we evaluate vendors in this space for their orchestration capabilities. We're going to try to position them in one of these top 5 chevrons. Are they orchestrating a registration flow? Are they orchestrating a login flow, et cetera? Or are they orchestrating an entire customer journey, this end user journey? As of right now, we haven't really seen a fully orchestrated end user journey from new engagement to ongoing engagement. So if you're listening to this and you're saying, hey, I have one of those, would love to talk to you, would love to see that and dig into it. But this is where we're really starting to kind of see this value. Again, there's a lot of orchestration players out there right now that are either new, or there's a lot of orchestration players out there that have been around for maybe a couple of years and are out there raising money. So if you're an investor in the space, you're looking at this, here are some of the components, here are the way that OWI kind of breaks things down to try to understand it. I'll open it up to Cameron. So, obviously you and I have dug into a lot of these companies. This is kind of what we started to see and to kind of congeal. What are your thoughts on orchestration, this landscape, and any other kind of feedback or kind of commentary for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really laid out the case for why orchestration is so big right now quite effectively. But, when you think about how these point solutions fit into this customer lifecycle, it's becoming increasingly obvious that across market segments, platforms are necessarily, purchasing all these point solutions. And if you think about the time and energy and, more importantly, engineering headcount required to stitch all of these together, the ability to, buy a single platform, connect once, and have them, take all of these integrations off your plate is really of tremendous value. It's not just that you can ostensibly offer a better customer experience when everything is seamlessly orchestrated, which I think you can in many ways. It is that you are removing so much of the time and effort and money required to keep everything humming along nicely, if you will, when you bring orchestration into play.
Yeah, Dave, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, look, I think just to make one very general point, like why do companies externalize developments of certain sort of like products, right? Like, to me, identity, investing in identity is attractive because it's applicable and a required service in every single market and network, right? But then why aren't all market network participants building these capabilities themselves, right? And so I think one of the core points just to make is, identity differentiation, or that identity flow, is not part of how, companies differentiate themselves, right? Like, to pick an example, if I'm a retailer, whether I'm a physical or digital retailer, I'm trying to differentiate myself based upon inventory and product curation and pricing. I'm not trying to differentiate myself based upon like what my like KYC flow is, like that's like it's a core competency. It's something I have to have, but it's not actually something that I want to use to differentiate myself. I just want something that works. And so, every industry market has to do these things, but they don't differentiate themselves on that. So it makes sense to externalize these development costs rather than trying to, this is that basic buy versus build decision, like you're going to buy this, not build it yourself, because there are economies of scale that a third party has access to that you wouldn't if you try to do it yourself. I think the other interesting point is I think, and I certainly think about this in the companies I invest in, but everybody's got to orchestrate. Everybody in identity is kind of orchestrating to some extent, or they have to integrate with certain third-party offerings, whether it's third-party data sets or just third-party products. And so it'll be interesting to see how, I kind of think of having an orchestration capability as sort of table stakes, one of those things that you have to do in order to make it easier for a buyer to adopt your product. That way, it's not necessarily future-proofing, but that you've now got the ability to integrate with other offerings as they develop or rise down the road. But what'll be interesting to see is how certain orchestration vendors then decide to build certain capabilities themselves. I think a lot of it is, which capabilities, third-party capabilities, are viewed as like having truly been commoditized. And then what are the things that are actually like unique and differentiated, potentially have network effects to them to some extent. And so I think we're going to see most people in both KYC or identification or onboarding players, as well as login and authentication. We're going to see them both integrate with third-party offerings, while also having certain capabilities that are developed in-house. So I think we're going to see a lot of like hybrids, and it'll be interesting to see who the winners are that emerge in sort of like 3 to 5 years down the road. I think we've probably hit on some of these dynamics, about how identity companies serving banking are going to probably develop a little bit differently than, say, the e-commerce or the trust and safety side that we would see with something like Airbnb or something like that. So that's kind of that's my quick sort of take on it.
No, I think that's a super important take on it. I do think that, again, we talk a lot about orchestration, but to your point, every identity company out there has strategic partnerships, integrations, et cetera. I think right now we're really thinking about companies that are just basically built on top of these types of interactions and relationships, and seeing success because of it. So should be interesting. I'm sure this is going to be a trend that we are going to keep covering, but we use the words orchestration a lot. Wanted to spend the time to cover what some of those trends are and what the hell we're talking about when we actually show it. So for those of you listening to this episode, apologies, you might actually need to turn on the video and watch this one. Which takes us to our next main topic of the month, which is our favorite topic, COVID passports. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it back over to you, Dave, to talk a little bit about kind of the COVID passport market dynamics and what you're seeing from an investor's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would actually almost say more. My take on this is almost more driven by my role as a private citizen necessarily than an investor, right? Which is to say, I think there's been a couple interesting announcements and then experiences I've just had as an individual. The FDA, the Pfizer vaccine has now received full FDA approval. I think there were some people who were reluctant to make policy based upon something that had an emergency use authorization rather than actually being fully approved. I think it's unclear to me to what extent that was politics versus actually like a valid concern, and to what extent there really like how much marginal improvement or what really has been the new data that's emerged in the last few months that's now given the FDA comfort, and what the difference is between this, the emergency use authorization and what we have now. But now, as a result, just in the last couple of days, there's been a couple of changes, right? So here in New York City, they've announced that all teachers will have to be vaccinated. If you look at some of the comments just a couple of weeks ago, even a month ago, both the teachers union was emphasizing the need for choice. They've now kind of dropped that, and Equifax said, no, look, everybody, to serve our communities, we all need to be vaccinated. So there's kind of been a change there. Again, it was announced, I think, in mid-September, I think it's September 17th or something like that. At that point, to go inside to a bar or restaurant in New York City, you'll have to be vaccinated. You'll have to show proof of vaccination. We've already seen individual restaurants now in New York saying, look, we're not going to wait for September 17th. I've gone to a couple places recently where just to get inside, you've got to either bring a vaccine card, a picture of the vaccine card, or you have to have the Excelsior Pass, which is that IBM blockchain-based product. So, we're seeing that people now again, like a picture of a vaccine card, I'm not sure, like, I don't think anybody in identity would say that that's like rises to a high level of assurance. But we're kind of seeing like, look, you got to show me something, right? I think we're going to start to see this increased bifurcation, and some of this will be driven by, different states and different regions. Certainly, that'll be driven by, Democrats for Republicans. There is some political tribal elements to this as well. But like, I think we're going to see that more and more the private sector, certain people are going to say, look, for the benefit of both my employees and my customers, we don't want to deal with people who aren't vaccinated. And there's enough consumer buying power in that vaccinated population right now where people are going to be very comfortable making that decision. And so that's what I think is driving this. And we'll see what actually what the actual product or tech, we've got a technical architecture is nothing new. I don't think there's anything particularly innovative happening. And we're also to the point of like orchestration and people choosing to do different things. Maybe we're going to need an orchestration layer for COVID passports, given that, the range of what is accepted as proof today is pretty wide and vast. So, that's my take on it. Like, we're finally going to start to use it, but we're a long ways from having consolidated around a specific solution or type of proof.
Yeah, and I think that's really a great point. I know we have some notable COVID passport initiatives going on here. Cameron, tell us about these kind of initiatives and why do they matter?
Yeah, so I think this is, there's currently at least 17 different, global COVID passport initiatives that we're aware of. I'm sure there's probably even more than that, some with low adoption. But this is a handful that I think our audience may or may not have heard of, and some that seem to be making an impact. And I think to, Dave's point around this problem being tackled both from public and private sector approaches, these are kind of illustrative of that. Clear, which just IPO'd recently, and most folks probably know from letting you kind of skip the security line at the airport, has tacked Health Pass Plus capabilities onto their platform. They've signed a number of contracts with sports arenas, in particular, for letting folks prove either a recent negative COVID test or their immunization record. They have both integrations with healthcare groups that let you certify kind of digitally that you've received a vaccination, or you can also physically kind of scan your vaccination card to turn that into a digital credential. So that's an example of the private sector kind of leading the way in terms of enforcing some of these mandates, a la Biden's, comments as of today that, they're expecting the private sector to kind of take the lead on holding folks to account in terms of vaccine mandates. In terms of the public sector, New York State has actually been a leader domestically here in the US in terms of rolling out a digital solution. I think what's unique about the Excelsior Pass is the fact that it is not just a digital wallet that holds a scan of a physical card, which I think, as we all know, opportunity for fraud, for folks to photocopy someone else's vaccination card, for example, and try and pass it off as their own. Excelsior Pass is really interesting because this actually links back to the New York State vaccination database and gives you a fully digital credential that you can leverage to prove to, for example, a New York City restaurant, now that vaccination is mandated. There's actually a companion app that the restaurant can use that can scan the QR code presented by a customer, and you can see their vaccine status, certified that is valid, not just from a physical card, but actually linking back to that originating database. And then last, another private sector approach, the IATA, the International Air Travel Industry Group, has their own IATA travel pass. They have signed up over 50 international airlines to take part in this system. And they are trying to kind of smooth some of those rough edges around the international collaboration around COVID testing. the IATA, in conjunction with the airlines, is rolling out this pass. It is in market now. Adoption is currently limited to the airline that you are flying, needing to support the pass. So, if you're flying Delta, for example, and they don't support it, it doesn't matter that you're flying to a country that will accept that pass. It is tied to your airline itinerary. But most excitingly, on that international collaboration front, both the UK and the EU are allowing the loading of their national government issued certificates that state you are either negative COVID or have been vaccinated and cleared to travel internationally, leave the country. You can actually load each of those certifications into the IATA app for passporting on your international journey between the UK and EU.
Well, I think you really nailed on this, I think, quite a bit. And unfortunately, we can't dig into it even more, but let's, because of our time here, but I think these are really, really interesting initiatives and really just tie into all of it, right? The orchestration components of this as citizens, to Dave's point, when he's like, I'm taking my investor hat off and looking at this just from a concerned, but also very in the know on what the hell this is, citizen and why this stuff matters. So I think it has a lot of far-reaching kind of implications, which actually I think takes us directly to our fields of dreams of our section here. Which, by the way, I really do love that we incepted that this actually happened in person. So kind of amazing there. I'm going to go ahead and clap ourselves in the back here. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. So again, if this is your first time joining us here on this forum, we like to break down our predictions for the next month. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen over the next month, but really kind of into that near short term kind of what do we as people kind of trying to analyze and understand. I think we even though during this show we tried to talk about common topics, this is where we get to say, hey, screw everything else here. Let's actually talk about what's really, really interesting to us and like what we want to try to understand to make some of our investments on. So starting with that, Dave, you have an Apple logo. What's going on with Apple here?
Yeah, I think I think for the last few years, historically Apple's really been considered sort of the leader in consumer privacy. There's a couple of things driving that, right? They didn't really monetize consumer data for advertising purposes, and just because of the premium price ascribed, associated with the product, Apple didn't really fall prey to that. If you're not the customer, you're the product, right? Like we were paying for it. It wasn't a free service like Google or like Gmail or Google search or Facebook, right? We're starting to see some of that change. And I think I wanted to highlight this. I know this is a controversial topic talking about, I know the acronym is CSAM, or, child sexual abuse material, I believe is that acronym. And this recent announcement that Apple has developed a capability to do some sort of on-device client-side, analytics around, does a phone possess child pornography, right? And I think you can certainly say there's good intentions there, but I think there's two different concerns, right? There's kind of this slippery slope argument, which is, okay, Apple's now developing a capability. They've now developed the capability, but ultimately the policy around how it's used is really driven by governments. And so what does that mean for Apple consumers, users in countries with potentially less of an appetite or less concern for privacy of its individual citizens? And so I think this is highlighting to Apple users that, yes, sure, maybe once upon a time this was the best product that was most attuned to kind of our privacy, but actually we really don't control these devices anywhere near as much as we think. Nobody reads that end user license agreement. When we click those iTunes, we just scroll, click accept. I think things like this, say that, hey, look, the capabilities of our phones, I'm an iPhone user. The capabilities of these phones is not fixed, and I really don't control how they work as well as I'd like. I think this could be a tailwind for adoption of self-sovereign identity or decentralized identity, certain hardware wallets where we do really control our keys, and we actually do have much more fixed capabilities of the hardware we're buying. So that's something that I'm looking at. I think there was different, we've seen some kind of different interpretations and analysis of this capability that Apple has developed and is going to be rolling out. But I think this one may have been mismanaged, and I think Apple's going to start to lose a lot of its positioning around being that sort of vanguard of consumer privacy when you look at both this and then also just the advertising business that they're now building as well. So I think we're going to see less and less differentiation and less halo around Apple as kind of like the years go on. So that was my call out for the week.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in terms of just kind of monitoring the situation. I guess it's let's see how people continue to react to it. How long does that stay out in the market? Obviously, a lot of these types of things seem to disappear. So let's see what happens. Yeah. With that one, I want to keep us moving here because then we're coming up on the hour quickly. More COVID. By the way, just so you guys know, our pictures, I just Google the most ridiculous possible Google image, and that's the first thing that always pops up. So I want you guys to all be absolutely aware that this is when you type in COVID passport, this is the first image that comes up. So Cameron, why are we talking more about passports here? And what is this IDAS stuff here at the bottom?
Yeah, so we'll cut to a special guest in a moment who can shed some more light. But, in calling out what we talked about last month, as well as this current trend, COVID and its impact on the ability of people to conduct transactions digitally tied to their identity is spurring more and more thinking and progress around EID or electronic identification platforms globally. In particular, the EU had recently announced in June that they are kind of dusting off their eIDAS regulation that governs both electronic identification programs within Europe, as well as the standards around digital signatures, and are giving it a look as that original eIDAS bill, I believe, is coming on 7 years old. So they're now opening up kind of this comment period as they look at reevaluating what the next iteration of this law is going to look like across the broader EU, similar to how they moved from PSD to PSD2, or I think they're on 5 AMLD now. So I actually had a chance to catch up with Sebastian Manhart, who is advisor on digital identity directly to the German Chancellor herself, Angela Merkel. So he joined us for a quick interview, and then I think we can dive back into some commentary here. What are you advising the German Chancellery on, and what is a quick overview of Germany's digital identity initiatives that you're spearheading?
So in short, Germany's basically having a second go at digital identity. The first go, which started in 2014-15, was not as successful as we hoped in terms of user adoption. And so now, led by Chancellor Merkel herself, there's essentially a second go where we're trying to roll out nationwide user-centric, decentralized, high utility digital identities for citizens. My job is to make sure that whatever we do in Germany, which is we can talk about is proceeding at full pace, is also mirrored ideally in Europe, so that we have a system that is not operated in isolation, but can operate across the continent.
I think that's really critical. What good is a digital identity unless it is actually usable across jurisdictions, across applications, across domains? I understand that you have seen some early success in terms of getting other EU member nations on board. Are you at liberty to share some of those successes?
Yeah, happy to. So we're in a quite privileged position where the head of state herself took charge of this topic, digital identity, which often in other countries people shy away from. But every country in Europe has some sort of strategy of how to manage digital identities. And we've seen a lot of countries that were quite attracted to our approach of sort of merging private sector approaches, public sector, a lot of business involvement, and this focus on self-sovereign decentralized identities. And so we're having discussions with all member states, but a couple are particularly interested, and I'm happy to announce, the announcement happened around 3 weeks ago, that Spain, the Kingdom of Spain, has officially joined this shared initiative, where essentially they're going to look at how they can roll out SSI-based digital identities within Spain. But crucially, we're going to figure out how to do it cross-border between Spain and Germany.
That's fantastic. And, broadening this out, obviously our core audience, digital identity practitioners, both in the private sector and the public sector, enterprises that obviously are counting on, the continued development of these digital identity initiatives as part of their core business. What would you say to those folks who are in the space right now regarding, this outlook for European digital identity? Can we count on the development and rollout of this pan-European effort? What should private sector players be thinking about this? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and I would say there's sort of three things that I would say there. The first one is that digital identity is just going to grow. In Europe, there's been a huge push as a result of the pandemic and the digitization of services. So that's here to stay, and that's growing. The second one is we're seeing an increased momentum behind decentralized identity, and that's something that we're personally very excited about. But there's a number of private initiatives and also increasingly public initiatives around decentralized, especially self-sovereign identity in Europe. And the third one is obviously EIDAS, the sort of framework that is being developed for cross-border European digital identity usage. That's going to take a while. It's now in the negotiation stage, but that can last between 2 and 5 years. But that's one to watch, because obviously that is going to have a huge impact on the legal framework around the use of digital identity in Europe.
So a huge thank you again to Sebastian for joining us. And I think the key takeaway here is really this renewed focus on interoperability. One of the key shortcomings of the previous EIDAS legislation was that it really allowed EU member nations, while conforming to the broader standard, to not have to build interoperability of their digital identity platforms at a fundamental level. You could kind of choose to essentially say, no, our system is going to stay within our national borders. And Germany really taking the lead in terms of trying to spearhead this initiative to gain consensus around the major EU economies and a path forward for interoperability, which is really going to be critical, again, similar to the discussion we had around COVID passports, to broader adoption of these initiatives. And I think what's so interesting about the approach Germany is taking and Sebastian is taking is they are really leaning on private sector leaders in the German economy to spearhead some of these initiatives as well. So, they shared some materials with me that highlight that they have 18 major companies across the German economy, including Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, Lufthansa, BMW, Volkswagen, Deutsche Post, Vodafone, and Telefonica, major stakeholders in the daily lives of folks in terms of these digital identity interactions to support this, self-sovereign approach to digital identity, interoperability, and alignment with these standards. And so I think it's a really, really key area to watch, because if the EU can take a leadership position here and really prove out the feasibility of this international interoperable digital identity credentials, I think that's going to be a major motivator and maybe, beacon of light, if you will, to other developed and developing economies that you too can succeed at EID and hopefully illuminate some paths forward and build on true, data privacy preserving, user-centric digital identities that can meet the needs of both, individual consumers and these business stakeholders alike.
So it sounds like, just listening to you and listening to him, it does sound like EID's here to stay, right? I think there's been a lot of questions about EIDs, how these things are going to work, the business model around it. Sounds like they're here to stay. We have 3 or 4 different types of bank ID programs out there. Now you have this German one coming up here. Are there, let's say you're a founder, you're a Series A founder right now, working in the United States, you're looking at maybe expansion to Europe in the next 12, 16 months. How should they be thinking about EIDs given this context?
That's a great question. I think to Sebastian's point, they're looking at, stakeholders playing a part in this, whether you are, a relying party or a verifying party. I think there are going to be private sector opportunities to play within these ecosystems, whether it's on the implementation side, whether it's on the credentialing side. If you look as an example at how some platforms have existed in competing areas that have both an open standard as well as private players playing in the space. I think, for example, open source software, Red Hat Linux is an example. You can roll your own solution built around an open standard, but there's also going to be probably some wide latitude for implementation partners and platforms that can take that implementation burden off of the plate of private sector companies to get them hooked in. 3D Secure in payments, I think another prime example of this. The card networks put out this 3D Secure standard. And if you want, as a merchant, you could build your own conforming solution. But most folks end up going with a vendor who takes care of the maintenance, takes care of making sure that they're staying in line with all of the latest updates. So I think that is where, if I was a private sector player looking to break into Europe, might set my sights is, what role can I play within this broader acceptance of EIDs? And is there an opportunity to build my platform to conform and align with these standards and help businesses implement EID who maybe do not have the bandwidth or desire to kind of build a solution themselves?
Unfortunately, we probably just sit here and talk about how EIDs and orchestration layers are going to work together, because I think it's probably the more critical component right now in the market. But we are actually over time, so I'll just quickly get through mine. Right now, I'm really interested in this consumer cybersecurity component. The Avast NortonLifeLock kind of merger here really sheds light on this component. We've been talking about consumer digital identity now for the better part of the last 18 months and talking about this transformation. There's a lot of companies right now that are in the consumer cybersecurity area, right? So if you're thinking about our landscape, that again is your antivirus, that's your identity theft protection, your password managers, your identity wallets, that side of the landscape. A lot of those companies have been pushing towards becoming an IAM player, working towards being a B2B or some form of enterprise cybersecurity player, not just a consumer cybersecurity player. So that has started to widen the gap in terms of capabilities for a lot of these existing players, opening up new opportunities for new consumer cybersecurity players or existing cybersecurity players that want to stay in the consumer side. Companies like Allstate Identity, really well positioned here to kind of take advantage of this. Companies with very strong brands that are tagged on to already building trust with the consumer can now have an opportunity to kind of pick the litter in terms of next steps in this consumer cybersecurity domain. Avast and NortonLifeLock, another really great team here, where those guys have both been very upfront that they're going to stick with the consumer. How do we stick with servicing the consumer? So really excited to see this consumer cybersecurity kind of bucket type start to grow. And I'm really excited to kind of see what these companies are going to do in terms of how they're going to evolve their business models. Because a lot of the password managers are evolving differently, right? And so I think a lot of password managers were really kind of set center stage to kind of own this space, specifically from a consumer digital identity perspective. And so to see this kind of dynamic shift as those password managers try to focus on B2B sales will be really, really interesting. So if you're probably something we're going to be talking a lot more about, and how consumers and consumer digital identity and consumer cybersecurity is evolving. But my current prediction, my dreams, my fields of dreams, if you will, is that we're going to have some more really cool consumer cybersecurity and digital identity applications and services here soon. So with that, want to thank everybody for joining. I know we are kind of stopping here quite abruptly. I think we ran over a little bit on time. But I want to thank everybody here for joining. If you want to get a hold of us, you can at info@oneworldidentity.com. We have this event every month, typically the third week of every month. So please do join it, add it to your calendar. You can always go to know.oneworldidentity.com and go ahead and see that feature schedule. But until next time, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Cameron, for joining. And we'll see you guys all back here in September. Thanks, everybody.